Hello, everyone. Welcome to the presentation of explosion-proof knowledge. First, let's learn the definition of explosion-proof. The explosion takes place in the conditions of three factors: air, oxygen, ignition source, and no combustible substances. The combustible substances include the gas, the vapor, the mist, and the dust. In order to avoid explosions and consequential dangers, the operator must incorporate effective explosion-proof protection precautions. We are impossible to avoid air, oxygen, in any environment, so what we can only do to avoid explosion is only to control ignition source. All explosion-proof electrical products mainly have 3 measures to stop electrical circuit to be an ignition source outside the enclosure below. The first measure: isolate the electrical circuit between inside the enclosure and outside the enclosure, to avoid the explosion escape from the inside to the outside of the enclosure. Even through electrical circuit can become an ignition source inside the enclosure. XD is called flame-proof type, which means the enclosures are constructed so that the internal explosions cannot be transmitted to the external atmosphere. The second measure: limit the energy of electrical circuit to avoid the electrical circuit to be an ignition source, such as control the temperature, limit the sparks, eliminate the fire. XE type is called increased safety type, which means all circuits are safe normally, but we make some measures to increase the safety level, to ensure no arc sparks or hot surfaces. XI type is called intrinsic safety type, which means our circuits are safe normally, but we change the circuit layout to limit the electrical current, to limit the spark's energy and surface temperature. The third measure: isolate the electrical circuit between inside the enclosure and outside the enclosure to avoid the electrical circuit to be an ignition source inside the enclosure. XO type is called oil immersion type, which means we use special explosion-proof oil to immerse the electrical circuits to isolate the electrical circuits from combustible substances outside the enclosure. XM type is called encapsulation type, which means we use special explosion-proof glue to seal the electrical circuits to isolate the electrical circuits from combustible substances outside the enclosure. XQ type is called powder filling type, which means we use special explosion-proof powder to seal the electrical circuits, to isolate the electrical circuits from combustible substances outside the enclosure. XP type is called pressurization type, which means we aerate inactive gas into the inside enclosure to make sure the air pressure inside the enclosure is higher than the standard atmospheric pressure outside the enclosure, to isolate the electrical circuits from combustible substances. XN type is called restrict breathing type, which means we melt, extrude, and glue the complete enclosure to isolate the electrical circuit inside the enclosure, to prevent combustible gas outside the enclosure entering into internal space inside the enclosure.